Alright, now we're in ZBrush. I recommend everybody start with this program and really go online and check out the Pixelogic website and just go through every tutorial. Jumping into this class, you have some familiarity with the program. I'm going to be moving pretty quickly, and so I'm not going to be spending too much time on basics. And in order to get a solid foundation in the program, I definitely recommend checking out the website, looking up stuff on YouTube, getting books. Just immerse yourself in this program so that you're comfortable with the interface and using it. So the only thing that you have to worry about is just your own pace, your own process, and your own creativity. So I have started off by loading just a standard sphere into the program, and this comes with 3 subdivisions. You can hit Shift F to see what the frame looks like, and this is a nice sphere. I mean, I could probably get a lot out of this. What we're going to be doing in this demo, we're going to be discussing working with Dynamesh and discussing the sculpting process. And my process is always working from low geometry to high geometry. When it comes to doing creatures, characters, anything organic, I recommend working this way. When it comes to hard surface stuff, that's when you might want to work with a higher density model so that you can get nice clean edges. We're not really worried about that. We're worried about establishing anatomy and structure. And the best way to do that, I find personally, is to work from low to high geometry. So let's discuss the interface. Now I've set it up what I'm most comfortable working with. It's a little different because I had to resize for Camtasia, but all of my brushes are nice and accessible down here. I don't like to touch the keyboard that often. Aside from using Shift to smooth out my model, I don't even like hitting Control-Z that much. Having just a panel filled with all the brushes that I use regularly speeds me up a bit. Also, you can see up here I've got a few things that I use regularly. Delete hidden geometry I use regularly. Close holes I'll use regularly. And you can customize your interface however you wish. The option for that is right here under Configuration. And you go to Enable Customize. You can actually start by moving things around just by hitting on a Mac Option and the Apple key, and you can just move things around. And then eventually, if you want, save it. It's up to you. Let's end that. So let's start sculpting. I don't want to worry about these higher subdivisions. When I get into more detail, more complex forms, I'm just going to jump into Dynamesh. So let's go and delete the higher subdivisions. Now the brushes that I mainly use for sculpting are Move, Standard, Clay. Yeah, that's about it. When I start refining my forms, I pretty much use everything else. I love the Damien Standard brush, Trim Dynamic, H-Polish, all of this. But I like to limit the way I work in the beginning. Using fewer tools ensures that I'll get through the model a bit more quickly. And of course, I'm not hunting around looking for stuff and switching it out. Same thing with working with low geometry. It forces me not to be detail-oriented, and that's something that I got from working with real clay. And there's a rule of thumb I like to remind myself of constantly, and that is when working with clay, you want to rough out your entire sculpt with your hands. Spend a lot of time doing it. When you take it that far just with your hands, you should be able to set the sculpt far away from you, and that sculpt should look done before you ever pick up a tool. And I thought, that's a really good rule. You're just worried about doing the important forms and not being detail-oriented. So, as you can see, I'm just starting with Move, and Move is absolutely wonderful. I can turn off my frame and I can just look at what we've got here. You'll also notice that I've used one of my standard materials, and that's basic material. You can see there are three options here. One's a little darker, one has a higher specularity to it. I just like the first one. Now this material helps me really see my forms very clearly, and that's really important. You also notice that as I'm working, I am moving my model around quite a bit. So my priority right off the bat is to create the basic head shape and the basic anatomy of what I'm going to be sculpting. And as you can see, with the limited geometry, I can really control my planes. Everything has a nice, and I really know what these forms are doing. I'm probably going to do something more creature-like, so I'm going to bring out the muzzle here. I don't really know what I'm going to sculpt quite yet, but I'm going to try out a few things, see what happens. Now, at any given moment, you're going to want some reference, and I've got some really cool stuff here. I'm looking at some bats and some primates, and that's what I'm going to start with for this this sketch. Obviously, bats have gigantic ears, and I know I'm pushing my geometry really far, but I don't have to worry about that. You'll notice, you'll know once we get into Dynamesh. An issue that people run into when working in ZBrush, I've noticed, is that they tend to work with too much geometry too soon, and they lose their form. And when I teach drawing, I always talk about breaking down your drawing in straight lines, knowing what the planes are, so that you don't lose your form. This is all just accomplished with the move brush. Let's pull these out a bit. Maybe a little bit more ape than not. So now we've got our basic skull shape here, and we want to make sure that all of the important features are accounted for. You want to see the cranium. It's this large portion, obviously. And there are a few things that I tend to enhance when working on a creature. These protrusions here in the back of the cranium, that's actually called the mastoid process, and that's actually where the sternomastoid connects those big dominant muscles in your neck to your sternum. So it actually connects from here down to there, wrapping around the neck. I'm not going to worry too much about the neck right now. When working in Dynamesh, you'll notice how you'll see how easy it is to just quickly pull a neck out of the base of a head. I want to make sure that the masseter muscle is well established, and that the mandible, the jaw bone, is clearly indicated. Maybe we don't worry about that nose at all, actually. I'm starting to think. I don't really care yet. I'll start thinking about that later. Alright, that's good enough. So we're going to move into Dynamesh right now. And the great thing about Dynamesh is you can turn anything into a Dynamesh, any model, as long as it doesn't have layers or subdivisions. It's very easy to get rid of both layers and subdivisions if that's getting in your way, just by simply deleting them. But we don't have any subdivisions here, so this should be pretty easy. And we're in the geometry palette under Dynamesh, and I'm just going to turn this on. I want to make sure that my resolution is still nice and low. Let's turn on Dynamesh and see what happens. So as you can see, let's try this again. If you leave project on, you'll get a little bit more of your edges. There it is. If you see, we've now gotten a lot more geometry. The mesh is quite a bit denser, and topology is evenly distributed throughout the model. Now we can sculpt and do whatever we want without having to worry about not having enough geometry to sculpt cleanly. So this is going to be our base right now to work with. Let's really break down what Dynamesh does. So let me duplicate this. Alright, so the main thing that Dynamesh does is it makes sculpting on the fly possible. Before, when working in ZBrush, you would have to work with something called Z-spheres, which we will get into using. They're definitely not obsolete. But the way Z-spheres worked was like you would create this basic armature-looking structure of your sculpture, and then from that, you would hit a button and create a low-res adaptive skin. So it was basically a mesh that you would begin sculpting with and dividing and increasing the geometry as you continue to sculpt and resolve some of your detail. So you really had to know what you were sculpting in the beginning. It was very important that you had a plan going into it so that you knew how to disperse your geometry and the density of your mesh before you started to actually take fine tools and carve into areas. Still a very cool tool, but you couldn't really get away with a bunch of fast changes. You needed a solid plan going into it. So now Dynamesh came out, and Dynamesh is actually the closest thing to clay that we have now. And I love it because you can really do anything to it, and the mesh actually repairs itself. So let's go in and I will show you that. So let's take a destructive brush and really see what Dynamesh can do. I've duplicated the tool because I intend to abuse this thing. And I'm going to take Snake Hook. Now you can see that the geometry is really suffering here and is unworkable. Pretty workable here, but as we get further into it, will not retain any detail. It just kind of crunches up. But if I were to hit Control and drag onto the side, you'll notice that it's added quite a bit of geometry to that new area, and I can start sculpting. So if I wanted to, what I could do is I could start sculpting ahead if I like it. I can pull the neck out, I can pull the shoulders out, I can pull the entire body out of that geometry and just add to the mesh. So it's a wonderful way to work, and I mean, you can really push this thing pretty far. And I still recommend people have a plan when working with Dynamesh and a basic idea of what they want to create, whether they do a few sketches or they gather reference of creatures that they want to incorporate in the design. Having some kind of plan going into it will enable you to move forward and be productive. Really cool stuff. So let's get rid of all that. And let's talk about the process of sculpting in Dynamesh and what tools we use. So we already played around with Move quite a bit. And let's pull a neck out of this. So by working with the mask tools, now that's another way in which I sculpt. You can quickly hit Control, mask out an area, hit Control-I, invert the mask so that everything else is masked except for that area you originally painted in, and we can play with the transpose lines. This is just the move line, hit the center circle, pull down, and now we have a neck. Control-click to the side. You'll notice that Control-click, by default, if you're not in Dynamesh, Control-click just clears a mask. So Control-click again, and now we have a dense neck, and we can go back to Move. We should be able to get a lot of this done just with the Move brush. Let's get the back of the head here. And when I tend to sculpt a character if I'm just doing some head studies. And as I mentioned before, you can establish what a creature will be from the head down. All patterns, all materials repeat themselves in the design, and when it comes to a creature, the head is the biggest payoff the audience has been waiting to see, especially in a horror film. They've just been seeing glimpses of a monster, and finally at the end they get to see that face, and so that face better pay off. Alright, so you can see now I've brought the geometry, I've actually pulled it into itself a bit. We hit Control, and you'll notice that Dynamesh has fused these areas together. Now there's another technique that I use with something called the backface mask that I'll show you a little later, but first I want to get this base done. And we can also use Control, and masking is great, but let's make sure that that's nice and diffused. You'll notice that if you work with a sharp mask and you want to move a section of the geometry, it'll be pretty harsh. And this goes to posing down the line, which we will be doing. If you tap while hitting Control the masked off area, you can diffuse the edge and get a more seamless transformation. Go up here, grab that, and just adjust the scale a bit, and that is good enough to start playing with. Smooth this out. I have a little bit more resolution, I think, than I want on this guy. So as I mentioned when we started, the technique is to use a little bit of resolution so that we can affect the model great. Edit this out. And we're at 38,000 polygons. That's a great way to work. Okay, so now that I have this base, I'm going to work with the clay brush. The clay brush is a nice big chunky brush, and I'm going to start laying in all of my forms with this. Notice that this brush tends to skip a bit, and so if you want something that follows you a little bit more, you can go to the freehand stroke. And let's darken our material a little bit. It's reflecting too much light. So with the clay brush, I can further define my creature, start to focus on the nose, the more complicated forms, and I'm always just thinking about the anatomy right off the bat. So I'm going to move a little bit more quickly. I've sped up the tape a bit, but you can see I'm just blocking shapes out with the clay brush. I'm going from Z add to Z subtract just by hitting Alt. You can notice I can carve in and add very quickly. This is a great way to work. Again, limiting your tool is very important. Just speeds everything up. I love working with the clay brush. And I'm just enhancing the anatomy, designing how the pectoral muscles might flow into the sternomastoid, which is actually very common amongst quadrupeds. You notice when quadrupeds are standing, they have no collarbones, so their pectoral muscles just seem to flow into the neck, hollowing out the eyes, defining the mouth. Notice as I'm working here, I'm very rarely hitting to the side and clearing the mask to rewrap the geometry. It's not necessary. Roughing out my secondary forms as quickly as possible. Now at this stage we're going to move into working with the standard brush. I prefer to work with the freehand stroke. Just want to control it a little bit more. And I have enough resolution here to explore my forms, to push things a bit, but I don't really have enough resolution to do anything like an eyelid, you know? And having that limitation is going to help me move around the model quite a bit. I'm going to want some kind of intricate bat nose, so I'm going to go back to, some more going on here. There we go. Let's see if that actually meshes well. So this would actually be a good time to talk about using the backface mask. So I've pulled up these pieces, and you'll notice that the piece is very thin. There are a couple of ways to get this a little thicker. The best way is to turn on the backface mask and just pull it out. Without the backface mask on, you can see it's collapsing in on itself. It's not great. With the backface mask on, I can pull it out and it stays put. And I'm just giving more volume for Dynamesh to work with. This might be too little. Let's see what happens. It's not bad. A little too narrow, but I can build on that as I work. So I can pull these forms just out a little bit more. We'll see what happens. I just want to indicate them a bit. Now, another thing that I tend to do is I can delete geometry. It's just the lasso brush, or lasso tool, but I will tap Alt and delete everything that is within the red space. So let's just delete it. And you can see that Dynamesh fills those holes in nicely. So that's just a bit of a thought for me. I don't know if I'm going to follow it. I'm seeing some interesting things in my reference that I might want to incorporate with my bat creature. I really like the nose on this. It's a little extreme. I kind of imagine that on a humanoid character, this protrusion would get in the way, so I might dial that back for the sake of the creature. Another thing that you have to keep in mind, if this is going to be a practical effect, and if it is this subtle, it probably would be most successful as a practical effect. You have to consider the materials. So when it comes to creature suits, even puppets, if it's not a felt puppet, one of the Muppets, then it's going to be made up of probably one of two materials, either foam latex or silicone, and they have different qualities, different properties to them. But the one thing that they have in common is that the further they get away from the actor's body, the more flexible they become. Meaning that once you go really far away from the actor's head, for example with these ears, if we were to go any bigger, they would probably start wagging around and it would be very hard to be intimidated by this character. So I've now moved into the damn standard brush, and I just want to carve into this creature. You would be surprised at just how deep details can go on real creatures. Let's just start with this. And I feel like I want to get more of the primate in here, but we'll see. We'll see what happens. And I just want to separate this out a bit. And I feel like if the ears are slightly a part of the head, then it would limit the wobble. So even at this stage, we're not limited. We can expand and change proportions just by using move, and I like to tap it really and just use it very gently. At this stage, it's very easy to get carried away with move, and these are a little too cartoony and sinister. There we go. Trying to go for subtlety. Let's push the brow a little bit more. Give him the ability to emote. Also, if we're designing for an actor, really have to know where his eyes are. There are a few things you cannot change on an actor's head: the location of his eyes and his mouth. Everything else you can move around for the most part. A nose can be problematic, but I've seen in some makeups where they'll actually create an apparatus to flatten a nose if they want to minimize it. If they really want to minimize it, sometimes they'll just remove it in post, a la Voldemort. So I want to play around a little bit with maybe some rigid materials coming up through here. Let's see what happens. This guy's looking pretty fun. Let's bring this these in a little bit. So here I'm using backface mask, and I'm just going to push the geometry into itself, knowing that Dynamesh will just heal itself beautifully. There we go. That's actually kind of cool. We can start to up the resolution. I'm just going to do just a little bit from 80 to 128. Sometimes Dynamesh sticks, and I'll have to just hit Shift to smooth a small area. There it is. That got nice and dense. So now I'm just going to work with the standard brush. I'm going to start chiseling out and pulling my secondary and tertiary details. Working with this guy, I'm imagining some kind of ape-like vampire. And so I always have my reference to the side of me, but I'm going to make sure that I keep it as grounded as I possibly can. It's always anatomy first. We're creating an illusion when we're doing a creature design. We're trying to create something that looks as if it could exist. Smoothing things out, carving them in. So I'm getting a lot of use out of this standard brush. I don't know, I like him kind of jowly. Really not getting into that forehead yet, and so it doesn't seem very consistent. Let's jump in here. Let me hit quick save. Primates have a lot going on in the forehead, so I really want to focus on that. I want to make sure that this creature can emote. He can really express himself. This might be one of the final stages of the vampire when he's most comfortable, or maybe vulnerable, or just a mid-transformation or full transformation. Let's get that going in here. Always important to have reference. You can actually tell when artists aren't using enough reference, and they tend to repeat themselves too much. Every creature looks like part of the same series, and I'm definitely guilty of that at times. That's what's wonderful about being a concept artist and working regularly. You don't have control over what you do all the time, and the job, I've noticed, has forced me to break out of my comfort zone, to do things that I'd never want to do on my own. I've done a lot of films over the years, and I'm always kind of surprised by the challenges that these films present. Personally, I'm pretty sure that people see me as the scary guy. I tend to get a lot of the monsters and the serial killers and stuff like that, because of course I have a portfolio filled with it. But every now and then I'll get something cute, and you've got to be versatile. I remember I got Hop back in the day. I was working at a design studio before it was greenlit, and we had to just kind of come up with a possible look for these rabbits. Everything had to be adorable, and that all goes to reference. And as a concept artist, you don't always get to do the cool gigs, but if your mentality is just to work your hardest and to always try to succeed, you'll find that you can pretty much design everything with the same set of rules of design. I mean, form follows function. Form follows function is very simple. You don't design something that contradicts the function of the design. You don't give a car square wheels. Wouldn't work. Bad design choice. Same reason why you wouldn't put a spike coming out of a creature's neck, especially like a sternomastoid or something like that, because there's really nothing to anchor a spike to, and it might hinder the creature's movement, for example. And spikes are a big issue with creature design. Let's say you think, oh, let's do something like that. Well, that's cool. That's got a lot of edge to it and makes it very clear this is a bad guy. But what happens if he lowers his head and turns to the side? He's going to stab himself in the cheek. You'll notice that everything in nature follows form following function. There's very rarely an animal out there that has something on his body that he doesn't really need because he's spent years evolving. Of course, there are some exceptions. Humans, for example, we've got some extra teeth, wisdom teeth, we don't really need because we haven't fully evolved yet. I mean, originally, if you follow evolution, which of course I do, hard to be a good creature designer without doing that. If you look back at early man, they had the big jaw, they had the big muzzle, they had a jaw that could contain all of those teeth. And over the years, the muzzle decreased in size, but teeth are unlike any other bones in your body. They're covered in enamel. They seem to almost last forever. And so evolution hasn't affected them as much. And so we have teeth we don't need still. And teeth that don't fit our new trim short jaws. So here I'm just designing some cool wrinkle patterns. I can just noodle forever with standard. I love it. But as you can see, I can't get full detail yet. If we zoom in here, it's still just a mess of, tiny little squares. And it's our job to just make it work in this limited way. We can always pull more out of it. But I'm not going to move from this density until I've affected everything I want to affect. I can still do quite a bit with what I have. So I'm going to take advantage of that. It's fun. I pull those ears out later. I can make drastic changes throughout the entire process. But this just helps me keep track of my form. I don't know if that jaw would be so clean. So you can see I'm not using that many brushes, and I'm getting pretty far. As I mentioned before, creature design is really the interpretation of familiar elements, whether it's manipulating human anatomy or integrating anatomy from other animals. It's how we do it, and how we do it believably. Well, it looks like I've been able to maintain the rule of 3 here. We've got kind of a gorilla head shape, and we've got the bat, and we've got the humanoid. And we're going to speed things up again. I'll be doing this throughout the demo just to speed things up a bit. So again, I'm just roughing stuff out with clay, basic anatomy, and I'm using backface mask to extend the model very quickly. Click to the side, smooth out, let the mesh repair itself, and I can be very aggressive with this. There's a lot of freedom when working in Dynamesh. I'm going to be integrating a lot of soft concrete brush into the sculpts, And I love using soft concrete because it just blends really well into itself, always holding on to reference, and I have tons of anatomy charts around me as I'm working all the time, playing around with the shoulder blades, trying to make it resemble wings without doing wings, and again using backface mask with the soft concrete brush to get the desired effect. Another more recent feature in ZBrush are the insert brushes, and here's a great insert brush. And so I'm just going to insert spheres into the eyes fairly quickly, get a good scale. Maybe I'm not too worried about an actor. I think I'll just push these out a little further than they should go. That actually could be something that they do in post. You can digitally alter a makeup, track the eyes, and then move them. Might as well. Yeah, that's cooler. Right around there. Okay. So if I were to remesh this, the eyes would be meshed together. What I love about Dynamesh is that it masks off everything when using an insert brush, except for what you recently inserted so that you can move it around. Notice if I clear the mask and then remesh, I lose that beautiful edge, and now it's all one piece, and I don't want to do that. And so if we look at the frame, I do want these to be different subtools. So I'm going to go into Split right here, and I'm just going to go to Group Split, hit OK, and now, as you can see in my subtool palette, they are different subtools. I'm just going to hide that. Let's bring that back up. Okay, so let's hide my frame, and I'm going to start sculpting the eyelids on top of that. So working with the eyes isolated, it's actually a lot easier to sculpt the eyes. I'd hate to have to do it from the mesh that the head is made from. By keeping the eyes isolated, I can adjust the size and work around it quite easily, make quick changes. And this reminds me of something that I used to do when working with maquettes. I used to put little marbles in the sculpt and sculpt the eyelids around that, adjusting the anatomy using the soft concrete brush. You'll notice I will go back and forth playing around with the soft concrete brush, and you'll see a lot of exploration in the sculpt and a lot of back and forth. When we move on to the rock rubber, you'll see much less exploration. That's because I already have the design resolved, and so I'm not hunting around looking for the concept and trying things out. So for the most part, I'm just working with standard soft concrete, and here I'm actually laying in some texture using an alpha and the standard brush. We'll go into that in depth in the rock rubber sculpt. But because ZBrush offers so much freedom, I can jump between detailing and pushing forms very easily. Here again with the standard brush and the damn standard brush, I'm able to carve in details into the lips. It's actually starting to remind me of a scroll for those of you who are Marvel fans. I love the organic quality of the soft concrete brush. I'm hunting around looking for depth wherever I can find it. If you really study wrinkles, you can see that there's a lot of shadows. They really have quite a bit of depth to them. Soft concrete again. I'm using it not only for texture, but also for form. The standard brush is a wonderful tool as well. You can get fine details by shrinking down the diameter, or you can scale it up and move to large forms. Adding little knobs to the end of the nose, breaking up the lips. Studying how skin wrinkles is really valuable. There's an anatomy to a wrinkle. Little dots, little skin changes in texture in the chin. I can really get into a zone working on just texture. Here again, more noise from the alpha using the standard brush. And we're just going to carve in, make sure all these forms are established. Soft concrete is just a great way to mass out these details, especially when working with high resolution. I find that because the brush blends into itself so seamlessly, I can use it when my mesh is over 1 million. And look at these fine details I'm able to get with a standard brush just by shrinking down the diameter. A lot of fun. As I mentioned, I can get into a zone and just have music going or some cartoons on my reference monitor. As I'm adding this detail, I'm imagining the face moving. I'm imagining the character talking, how the mouth articulates, and what wrinkles would develop from that over time. Really pushing the nose. These bats have very intricate noses. Again, reestablishing texture with the alpha. It's a great way to just break up the skin, change the surface of the clay. Adding veins, very simple. Again, just shrinking down the diameter of the standard brush. Notice I'm not remeshing that often. Here I'm just using the clip brush to get a clean edge there. Trim Dynamic, it's a very aggressive brush. I'll start just chiseling forms out. Notice that I changed my mind a bit on the chest and had to redo the veins. What I love about Dynamesh is that you can be so aggressive with it, and it doesn't take a lot of time to take an area that you don't like and completely redo it. It makes you a bit fearless. It was something that I never got to with my experience in clay. I was only working with clay as a child for, 10 years is a long time, but at a young age, your hands don't always do what your brain wants them to. But there was something so permanent about working with clay. There's no Control Z. So having that and being able to try a lot of things very quickly is really great for a designer. Plus, if you like where the design's going and you want to try something else, you can just duplicate the model and tweak it. Show the client another variation, which is something we'll be doing very soon. It's really starting to feel like a very powerful creature. You could kind of imagine him in some alien prison being intimidating. Those are other questions that I ask myself as I'm working. Not just how does the creature function, but if it's a character, which this is definitely a character, what setting would he be in? What is his role in the story? So after getting to this point in the sculpt, in Dynamesh, it's actually very easy to come up with quick options. So by duplicating the model, I created this variation on the design. And as you can see, as I go between these two, you can really tell what I did. I elongated the torso, I got rid of the rigid material from the sternum, and I changed the nose a bit. And it's really interesting to see how these subtle changes influence the character. This is now a much more solid thug like creature, and because the shape of the nose is so reduced, it actually makes him appear a bit more solid than this creature. This actually comes off almost more whimsical in a way. So we can come up with a ton of options after finishing the initial sculpt. We could pull horns out of the head. We could, of course, pull out the remaining body, still in Dynamesh, and finish that sculpt. So that is Dynamesh.